Mom, I promise I'll make you proud today, 16-year-old Zara Williams whispered to the silver-framed photograph on her nightstand, her fingers tracing the glass that separated her from the woman who would never see her daughter's dreams come true. The alarm hadn't even sounded yet, but sleep had been impossible anyway, her mind racing with melodies and fear in equal measure as the weight of today's audition pressed against her chest like a physical thing. Outside her bedroom window in their quiet Atlanta neighborhood, the world was still dark at 5:30 a.m., but Zara had been awake for hours, watching the digital clock count down the minutes until she would board a plane that would either carry her toward her dreams or away from them forever. She moved through her morning routine with the precision of someone who had learned that discipline was the foundation of greatness, her movements fluid and purposeful as she made her bed with military corners and arranged her sheet music in the exact order she would need it. The house around her held the comfortable silence of a home where love lived in small gestures and shared understanding, where her father David had learned to move quietly in the mornings so his daughter could have these precious moments of preparation. The kitchen smelled of coffee and possibility when she padded downstairs in her NASA pajamas, a reminder that brilliance came in many forms, and that she had always been encouraged to reach for stars, whether they were musical notes or distant suns. David Williams looked up from his engineering journals with the kind of smile that made Zara believe she could conquer the world, his presence a steady anchor in the storm of her pre-audition anxiety. "Ready for today, Sparrow?" he asked, using the nickname that had followed her from childhood when her voice had been as light and quick as a bird's song. The childhood name still fit somehow this small girl whose mind soared higher than anyone expected, whose innovations had already changed how children learned music across 47 countries. Harmony Bridge, the educational app she had created when she was 13, had started as a simple solution to help kids like her younger cousin who struggled with traditional music theory. But it had grown into something that teachers around the world relied on to make music accessible to students who had been left behind by conventional methods. The success still felt surreal, sometimes this reality, where she was simultaneously a teenager worrying about pimples and pop quizzes, and a tech entrepreneur whose work had been featured in magazines that usually ignored people 3 times her age. Nervous, she admitted accepting the hot chocolate he offered with hands that trembled slightly from anticipation rather than caffeine, the ceramic mug warm against her palms as she breathed in the familiar comfort of home. The Juilliard audition committee has probably never seen someone like me walk through their doors, and I keep thinking about all the ways I could mess this up. David sat beside her at the kitchen island, his own coffee forgotten as he studied his daughter's face with the attention he usually reserved for complex aerospace calculations. "You know what your mother used to say about stages that seemed too big for us?" he asked, his voice carrying the gentle weight of memory that never quite stopped hurting but had learned to inspire instead of paralyze. Zara shook her head, hungry for any piece of her mother she hadn't heard before, any fragment of wisdom that could carry her through the day ahead. Her mother had been gone for 8 years now, claimed by cancer, when Zara was too young to understand that brilliant women could be stolen away by something as mundane as faulty cells. But her influence lived in every note Zara played and every dream she dared to chase. She said that we don't perform to prove we belong somewhere. David continued his engineer's mind, finding comfort in the precision of remembered words. We perform because the world needs what we have to offer, and it's our responsibility to share it, whether they think they want it or not. The words settled into Zara's chest like a warm weight, steadying her breathing and clearing her mind in the way that only truth could do. She thought about the Stradivarius waiting in its climate-controlled case upstairs, a 1738 instrument on loan from a patron who believed in her talent enough to entrust her with something worth more than most people's houses. And she felt the familiar thrill of knowing that today she would make it sing in ways that would honor both its history and her future. "The car will be here in an hour," David said, glancing at his watch with the practiced timing of someone who had learned that success was often measured in minutes and preparation. "Double-check that you have everything, And remember that no matter what happens today, you've already achieved more than most people dream of achieving in a lifetime." Zara nodded, finishing her hot chocolate and heading upstairs to gather the materials that would determine her future, her movements steady now that she had remembered who she was and where she had come from. Today wasn't about proving she deserved to be in rooms where people questioned her presence. Today was about showing the world what happened when talent met opportunity, regardless of what package it came in. Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport pulsed with the controlled chaos of early morning travel, its corridors filled with the sharp scent of overpriced coffee and the electric tension of thousands of people rushing toward their individual destinies. Terminal F buzzed with particular intensity around Gate B12, where Flight 847 to LaGuardia was experiencing the kind of overbooking situation that brought out both the best and worst in human nature. Zara stood near the panoramic windows overlooking the tarmac, her violin case resting against her legs like a loyal guardian, its silver surface catching the artificial light and reflecting it back in patterns that reminded her of sheet music come to life. The case wasn't just luggage to her. It was a fortress containing everything that mattered, everything she had worked toward, everything that her mother's memory demanded she protect and nurture. She watched the gate area dynamics unfold with the observational skills that had made her such an effective app designer, noting how people arranged themselves in invisible hierarchies based on boarding groups and seat assignments and assumptions about who belonged where. The businessmen in expensive suits claimed territory near the priority boarding lane with the confidence of people who had never been told they didn't belong anywhere, while families with children created small islands of controlled chaos around outlets and children's entertainment. "This is ridiculous." A sharp voice cut through the ambient airport noise, drawing Zara's attention to a woman whose entire presence seemed to demand that the world rearrange itself for her convenience. Patricia Whitmore commanded attention not through charm or authority, but through the kind of entitlement that came from a lifetime of having her complaints taken seriously and her comfort prioritized above all else. Patricia was the kind of woman who treated service workers like furniture and teenagers like interruptions. Her perfectly styled blonde hair and designer handbag serving as armor in a world where she had learned that appearance could substitute for substance if wielded with enough conviction. She stood near the gate desk, her voice rising with each sentence as she explained to the increasingly frazzled gate agent exactly why her situation was more urgent than anyone else's. "I don't care about your computer system," Patricia continued, her manicured finger tapping against the counter with staccato precision. "I have a charity luncheon in Manhattan at 2 o'clock, and these people need to understand that some passengers are more important than others." Zara turned her attention back to her sheet music, recognizing the type of person Patricia was, and having learned from experience that engaging with such individuals rarely led to anything productive. She had encountered Patricia's spiritual siblings in boardrooms and conference halls, people who looked at her and saw only what they expected to see rather than what was actually there. The flight crew emerged from the jet bridge with the practiced efficiency of people who had performed this routine thousands of times, their uniforms crisp and their smiles professional as they prepared for what should have been a routine Tuesday morning flight. Lead flight attendant Michelle Torres moved with the authority of someone who had spent 18 years in the sky, her bearing suggesting competence and control even as something darker flickered behind her eyes. Michelle had once loved her job, had once felt genuine pleasure in helping passengers and ensuring their safety, but years of thankless service and a recent divorce that had left her bitter and financially strained had transformed her passion into something closer to resentment. She looked at the crowded gate area with the expression of someone who saw problems, rather than people challenges, rather than individuals with their own stories and destinations. Beside her flight attendants, Jake Morrison and Tony Rodriguez checked their watches and scanned the crowd with the casual confidence of men who had never been afraid of confrontation, their muscled frames and steady gazes suggesting they were more comfortable with enforcement than service. They had learned to follow Michelle's lead without question, trusting her experience and authority in situations that required quick decisions and decisive action. Group 1. First Class and Diamond Medallion members, welcome to begin boarding the gate. Agent announced, her voice carrying the forced cheerfulness of someone who had been dealing with Patricia's complaints for the past 30 minutes. Zara gathered her belongings and moved toward the priority lane, her boarding pass clearly indicating seat 2A and her right to be among the first passengers to board. Her appearance drew curious glances from other travelers, some noting the expensive violin case and wondering about the story it represented, others making assumptions based on her age and appearance that would prove both dangerous and costly. The jet bridge stretched ahead of her like a tunnel leading toward her future, its fluorescent lights and industrial carpeting a stark contrast to the dreams and fears that filled her mind as she walked toward the aircraft that would carry her either toward triumph or devastation. "Excuse me, sweetie, but economy boarding isn't for another 20 minutes. Patricia Whitmore's voice sliced through the boarding area with the sharp precision of someone accustomed to correcting what she perceived as other people's mistakes. Zara paused in the priority boarding line, her violin case balanced carefully at her side, as she turned to face a woman whose expression mixed condescension with the kind of automatic assumption that had defined too many of Zara's experiences in spaces where she supposedly didn't belong. Patricia's smile was the kind that didn't reach her eyes, the kind that suggested she believed she was doing Zara a favor by pointing out what she assumed was an obvious error. "I'm in seat 2, Zara replied quietly, her voice carrying the calm confidence of someone who had learned to navigate these encounters with grace rather than anger, though the familiar sting of being questioned in spaces she had every right to occupy never quite stopped hurting. She held up her boarding pass, the first-class designation clearly visible to anyone who bothered to look, though she had learned from experience that people like Patricia often saw only what they expected to see, rather than what was actually in front of them. The boarding pass was legitimate, purchased with money earned from an app that had revolutionized music education for millions of children. But Zara knew that her youth and appearance made some people assume her presence in first class must be some kind of mistake or charity. Patricia's laugh was sharp and ugly, the sound of someone whose worldview was being challenged in a way that made her defensive rather than curious. "Staff travel," I'm sure she said with the dismissive certainty of someone who had never been wrong about anything that mattered to her. It's absolutely ridiculous what they allow these days, letting anyone sit up front just because of some diversity initiative or employee benefit program. The words hung in the air between them like smoke from a fire that was just beginning to catch, and Zara felt the familiar weight of other people's assumptions settling on her shoulders like a coat she had never asked to wear. She had built a multi-million-dollar company from her bedroom, had been featured in magazines and invited to speak at conferences, had earned every opportunity that had come her way through talent and hard work and innovation, but none of that mattered to people who had already decided what her story must be. "Please, don't put that guitar thing in the overhead bin above my seat." Patricia continued, her voice rising enough to draw attention from other passengers who were trying to mind their own business while secretly watching this familiar drama unfold. "I have a hatbox that needs that space, and musical instruments should really be checked anyway." Zara didn't respond to the provocation, having learned that engaging with people like Patricia often led to escalation rather than understanding, and instead simply stepped around her toward the gate agent who was scanning boarding passes with mechanical efficiency. The scanner beeped its green approval when Zara's pass was read, a small sound that should have been definitive, but that somehow felt like a minor victory in a battle she hadn't asked to fight. The walk down the jet bridge felt longer than usual, each step carrying her toward an aircraft where the real test of her composure would begin, where the confined space and recycled air would amplify every tension and every assumption, until small conflicts became major confrontations. The fluorescent lights overhead cast harsh shadows that made everything feel slightly unreal, as if she were walking through a tunnel toward an uncertain destination. Michelle Torres stood at the aircraft door with the practiced smile of someone who had greeted thousands of passengers, her uniform crisp and her bearing professional as she welcomed travelers aboard Flight 847. Her eyes took in each passenger with the quick assessment of someone trained to spot potential problems, and when she saw Zara approaching with her violin case, something shifted in her expression. The sight of a teenage black girl carrying what appeared to be an expensive instrument into first class triggered assumptions that Michelle didn't bother to examine too closely. Assumptions rooted in years of dealing with passengers who tried to sneak into premium cabins or who carried items that didn't belong in overhead compartments. Her recent personal troubles had left her with little patience for what she perceived as potential problems, and she decided to establish authority before any issues could develop. Miss Michelle said, stepping directly into Zara's path with the kind of positioning that was meant to stop movement and command attention. "You'll need to check that instrument at the gate. Large items aren't permitted in the cabin, especially not in first class where space is limited." Zara felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came with being challenged in situations where she had done nothing wrong, but her voice remained steady as she replied, "It fits in the overhead compartment, ma'am. It's FAA approved as carry-on luggage for musical instruments, and I have the documentation if you need to see it." The mention of regulations seemed to irritate Michelle rather than reassure her, and Zara could see the older woman's expression hardening into something that suggested this conversation was about more than just luggage policies and overhead bin space. The aircraft door sealed with the definitive thud that transformed 200 strangers into a temporary community bound by shared destination and recycled air. But the atmosphere in first class felt more like a powder keg than a luxury cabin, as tensions that had begun on the ground intensified in the confined space above the clouds. Zara settled into seat, 2A, with the careful precision of someone who had learned to claim her space without apology, while remaining alert to the undercurrents of hostility that seemed to follow her into rooms where her presence was questioned. The leather seat should have been comfortable, the extra legroom and premium service a reward for success earned through innovation and hard work, but the weight of Patricia Whitmore's stare from seat 2B made relaxation impossible. She opened her leather portfolio and spread her sheet music across the tray table, trying to lose herself in the familiar comfort of notes and measures that made sense in ways that human behavior often didn't. The audition pieces required her full attention, each phrase demanding technical precision and emotional depth that would prove to the Juilliard committee that she deserved her place among the next generation of classical music's brightest stars. Patricia's breathing seemed unnecessarily loud in the small space between their seats, each exhale carrying what sounded like barely contained irritation as she shifted and sighed with theatrical displeasure. "Do you have to spread all that paper around?" she asked, her voice sharp enough to cut through the ambient aircraft noise. "Some of us are trying to relax, and the rustling is incredibly distracting." Zara looked up from her music with the kind of patience that had been hard-earned through similar encounters, her voice remaining calm despite the familiar sting of being criticized for existing in a space where someone else had decided she didn't belong. "I'm just reviewing my audition pieces," she said, quietly gathering the pages slightly closer to her own space. "I'll try to be quieter." The concession should have ended the conflict, but Patricia's irritation seemed to feed on itself, growing larger with each moment until it filled the space between them like a toxic cloud. "Audition," she repeated with the kind of skeptical tone that suggested she found the very concept laughable. "Let me guess, some kind of diversity scholarship program that lets anyone think they can just waltz into places they don't belong." The words hit Zara like physical blows, each assumption more wrong than the last, each syllable carrying the weight of a worldview that reduced her accomplishments to handouts and her presence to charity. She had earned her audition through years of practice and study, had built a technology company that served millions of students, had proven herself in boardrooms and concert halls. But none of that mattered to someone who had already decided what her story must be. Michelle Torres appeared beside their row with the timing of someone who had been listening to the exchange and waiting for an opportunity to assert authority, her expression suggesting that she had chosen sides in a conflict she didn't fully understand. "Is everything all right here?" she asked, though her tone indicated she had already determined where the problem lay. "I'm trying to prepare for meditation," Patricia said with the kind of dramatic emphasis that made her sound like the victim of some terrible injustice. But this child keeps humming and shuffling papers and just generally making it impossible for paying customers to enjoy their flight experience. Zara felt the familiar weight of being reduced to a problem that needed solving rather than a person who deserved basic respect, and she could see in Michelle's eyes the same assumptions that had followed her through airport security and boarding lines and every other space where her age and appearance made people question her right to be there. "I wasn't humming," she said, her voice still controlled but carrying a slight edge of frustration that came from being forced to defend herself against lies. "I can hear you breathing." Patricia continued, her voice rising enough to draw attention from other passengers who were pretending not to listen, while secretly absorbing every word of the unfolding drama. "It's very distracting, and I think it would be better for everyone if she moved to a more appropriate seat in the back of the plane." Michelle nodded with the kind of understanding that suggested she saw Patricia as a reasonable person, making a legitimate complaint, and when she looked at Zara, her expression carried the weight of judgment already rendered. "I'm afraid first class is completely full," she said to Patricia, her tone apologetic in a way that it never was when addressing Zara. "But I can check if there's space in economy comfort where she might be more comfortable." The suggestion hung in the air like a challenge, and Zara felt something shift inside her chest as the injustice of the situation crystallized into sharp focus. She had paid full price for her first-class ticket, had earned her place through achievement and success, had done nothing wrong except exist in a space where someone else had decided she didn't belong, and now she was being asked to accept exile as the solution to someone else's prejudice. "I paid for my seat," she said, her voice carrying more strength than it had before, the kind of quiet power that came from finally reaching the limit of what she was willing to tolerate. "I have every right to be here, and I'm not moving because someone else is uncomfortable with my presence." The words seemed to electrify the atmosphere around them, and Zara could feel other passengers shifting in their seats, some with discomfort at the growing conflict, others with recognition that something significant was happening in the small space of their shared journey. Patricia's face flushed red with the kind of anger that came from having her authority questioned by someone she considered beneath her, and Zara could see the exact moment when annoyance transformed into something more dangerous, something that would demand satisfaction regardless of who got hurt in the process. "Don't you dare speak to me with that attitude." Patricia hissed, her voice low enough to avoid drawing more attention, but sharp enough to cut through the ambient aircraft noise like a blade. "I don't know what kind of special treatment you're used to getting, but this is the real world. And in the real world, children show respect to their betters." Zara felt her hands tighten on her sheet music as the words washed over her, each syllable designed to diminish and dismiss, to reduce her to something small and powerless and unworthy of basic human dignity. She had heard variations of this speech before in boardrooms where executives assumed she was someone's assistant, in conferences where attendees questioned whether she had earned her speaking slot, in every space where her success challenged someone else's assumptions about who deserved to succeed. The aircraft hit a small patch of turbulence that caused drinks to slosh and papers to rustle, but Patricia's movement seemed too deliberate to be explained by atmospheric conditions as she reached under the seat in front of her to retrieve her oversized handbag. Her elbows swung wide as she maneuvered in the cramped space, and Zara's water bottle, which had been sitting innocuously on her tray table, suddenly went flying. The water didn't splash randomly or disperse across multiple surfaces, as it would have in an actual accident. Instead, it seemed to find Zara with deliberate precision, soaking through her jeans and cascading across her leather music portfolio in a way that left no doubt about Patricia's intentions. The cold liquid hit Zara's skin like a shock. But the real impact was watching her carefully prepared sheet music absorb water that would leave permanent stains and wrinkles on pages that weren't even hers to damage. "Oh my," Patricia said with theatrical concern, her voice carrying exactly the kind of false sympathy that made her guilt obvious to anyone paying attention. "Look what you made me do with all that fidgeting and movement. I hope those papers weren't important." Zara stared at the spreading water damage with the kind of horror that came from watching something irreplaceable being destroyed, her mind calculating the cost of replacing rental music and wondering how she would explain to the conservatory that their carefully preserved scores had been ruined by someone else's malice. These weren't just pieces of paper. They were her connection to composers who had been dead for centuries, her roadmap to a future that suddenly seemed much less certain. "Those are rental scores from the conservatory," Zara said, her voice tight with the kind of controlled panic that came from watching disaster unfold in slow motion. "They're antique reproductions, and I'm responsible for any damage." She stood up instinctively, trying to assess the extent of the water damage and salvage what could be saved. Her movements careful but urgent as she lifted soggy pages and tried to separate them before the ink could run completely. The action was purely practical, the natural response of someone trying to prevent further damage to something valuable and irreplaceable. "Sit down." Michelle's voice cracked through the cabin like a whip sharp enough to make several passengers jump and turn in their seats to see what crisis required such aggressive intervention. "The seatbelt sign is on and you are not permitted to stand during taxi operations." Zara looked up from her damaged music with the kind of confusion that came from being yelled at for trying to clean up someone else's mess, her mind struggling to process how she had suddenly become the problem in a situation where she was clearly the victim. "She poured water on my music," she said, gesturing toward Patricia with the kind of helpless frustration that came from stating obvious truths that no one seemed willing to acknowledge. "I did no such thing," Patricia declared with the righteous indignation of someone whose lies had been rehearsed and refined through years of practice. "This girl has been aggressive and disruptive since the moment she sat down, making noise, spreading her belongings everywhere, and now she's trying to blame me for her own clumsiness." The accusation hit Zara like a physical blow, each word chosen with surgical precision to paint her as the aggressor in a situation where she had been nothing but patient and polite. She could feel other passengers watching the drama unfold could sense their discomfort with the conflict, but also their reluctance to get involved in something that didn't directly affect them. "I think she might be on drugs," Patricia continued, her voice rising to ensure that everyone in first class could hear her character assassination. "Her pupils are dilated and she keeps talking to herself and making these strange humming noises. I'm actually concerned for everyone's safety." The drug accusation seemed to flip a switch in Michelle's mind, transforming what might have been a minor customer service issue into a potential security threat that required immediate and decisive action. Zara could see the change in the flight attendant's expression, the way her jaw tightened and her stance shifted into something more aggressive, more ready for confrontation. "Miss, I am giving you a direct order to sit down and remain quiet, or I will have you removed from this aircraft," Michelle said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that suggested she had made this speech before and was prepared to follow through on her threats. "This is your final warning." Zara looked down at her waterlogged music, at pages that represented months of preparation and thousands of dollars in replacement costs, and felt something crack inside her chest as the injustice of the situation crystallized into sharp focus. "I need towels to dry this," she said, her voice rising for the first time as patience finally gave way to righteous anger. "She deliberately poured water on my audition music, and now you're threatening me for trying to save it." The words seemed to hang in the air between them like a challenge, and Zara could see in Michelle's eyes that any pretense of customer service had been abandoned in favor of something much more personal and much more dangerous. Michelle Torres had reached her breaking point, and 16 years of suppressed frustration with difficult passengers and personal disappointments crystallized into a moment of absolute authority that brooked no challenge or question. Her hand shot out with practiced precision, wrapping around Zara's wrist with the kind of grip that was meant to establish dominance and control, crossing a line that flight attendants were trained never to cross unless faced with genuine threats to aircraft safety. The physical contact sent shockwaves through Zara's nervous system, her body responding with the instinctive recoil of someone who had been grabbed without warning or justification. Her arm jerking back as she tried to free herself from a grip that felt more like an attack than any kind of legitimate safety intervention. "Don't touch me!" she yelled, her voice carrying the sharp edge of fear and violation as she stumbled backward in the narrow aisle. The words seemed to trigger something primal in Patricia, who saw an opportunity to transform herself from aggressor to victim, with the kind of theatrical performance that would have impressed drama teachers if it hadn't been so malicious in its intent. "Assault," she screamed, her voice rising to a pitch that could probably be heard in economy class. "She just attacked the flight attendant. I saw her hit Michelle. This girl is dangerous." The accusation exploded through the first-class cabin like a bomb, instantly transforming the atmosphere from tense to genuinely threatening as other passengers began to shift in their seats and look around for exits or hiding places. Patricia's performance was Oscar-worthy in its conviction, her face a mask of terror as she pointed at Zara with trembling fingers that suggested mortal fear rather than manufactured outrage. Michelle's radio crackled to life as she keyed the device with shaking hands, her voice breathless with what sounded like genuine panic as she called for backup to handle what she described as a security emergency. Code yellow in first class, she announced using terminology that suggested imminent danger. "Passenger has become combative and struck a crew member. I need immediate assistance from ground security." Zara backed against the galley wall with her hands raised in the universal gesture of surrender, her mind reeling from how quickly the situation had spiraled beyond anything resembling rational dispute resolution into something that felt like a nightmare, where up was down and victim was perpetrator. "I didn't hit anyone," she said, her voice carrying the desperate quality of someone who could see the trap closing around her but couldn't find a way to escape. "I just pulled my arm away when she grabbed me." Jake Morrison and Tony Rodriguez came charging up the aisle from their stations in economy with the kind of aggressive momentum that suggested they were responding to a genuine threat rather than a customer service dispute that had gotten out of hand. They were large men who spent their free time in gyms and their work time dealing with drunk passengers and medical emergencies, and they approached the situation with the assumption that physical force was not only justified, but necessary. "Get on the ground. Now!" Jake shouted, his voice carrying the authoritative bark of someone accustomed to immediate compliance, his hands already reaching for Zara as if her surrender position meant nothing compared to Michelle's radio report of assault and combative behavior. Zara's world seemed to slow down as she processed what was happening, her mind struggling to accept that she was about to be physically restrained for the crime of trying to clean up water that someone else had deliberately spilled on her belongings. "What? No, I didn't do anything wrong," she cried out, pressing herself harder against the galley wall in a futile attempt to avoid what seemed increasingly inevitable. Tony moved with the practiced efficiency of someone trained in physical restraint, his hands grabbing Zara's shoulders as Jake swept her legs, sending her crashing to the cabin floor with an impact that knocked the breath from her lungs and left her gasping against carpet that smelled of industrial cleaning chemicals and thousands of footsteps. The takedown was swift and brutal, designed to subdue rather than preserve dignity, executed with the kind of force typically reserved for genuinely dangerous individuals. The zip ties came out with practiced speed, plastic restraints designed for passengers who posed actual threats to aircraft safety, now being applied to the wrists of a teenager whose only crime had been existing in a space where someone else had decided she didn't belong. Zara felt the plastic bite into her skin as the ties were pulled tight, cutting off circulation and sending shooting pains up her arms that mixed with the throbbing in her ribs from hitting the floor. "Stop! You're hurting me!" she screamed, her voice breaking with the kind of terror that came from complete helplessness from being at the mercy of people who had already decided she was guilty of crimes she hadn't committed. "Please, just check the security cameras. I didn't assault anyone. I just want to call my mother." The mention of her mother seemed to enrage Michelle further, as if family connections were just another sign of Zara's entitled attitude rather than the natural response of a frightened child who needed adult protection. "We don't care who your mommy is," Michelle spat, standing over Zara with the satisfaction of someone who had finally exerted complete control over a situation that had challenged her authority. "You're going to jail, and that violin is going straight into the cargo hold where it belongs." Zara's face was pressed against the rough carpet as Tony's knee dug into her back, keeping her pinned, while Jake secured her restraints and Michelle coordinated with the cockpit about returning to the gate for law enforcement intervention. The physical discomfort was nothing compared to the psychological trauma of being treated like a dangerous criminal for defending herself against deliberate provocation and assault. "Captain, we have successfully subdued a violent passenger who assaulted crew members and created a disturbance in first class," Michelle announced into the aircraft interphone, her voice carrying the breathless satisfaction of someone who believed she had prevented a major incident. "We need to return to the gate immediately and have police waiting to take her into custody." Through the fog of pain and humiliation, Zara heard Captain Elena Rodriguez's voice crackling through the cabin speakers as she announced the return to gate, her professional tone betraying no hint that she understood the magnitude of what had just occurred in her aircraft. The plane began its slow turn back toward the terminal, carrying Zara toward what she believed would be arrest and prosecution for crimes that existed only in the imagination of people who had decided she was guilty before any evidence was examined. As the aircraft systems hummed around her and passengers murmured among themselves about the disruption to their travel plans, Zara closed her eyes and whispered words that would soon prove prophetic. "You have no idea what you've done." No idea. The Boeing 737 limped back toward Gate B-12 with the mechanical reluctance of an aircraft returning under circumstances no pilot wanted to face its engines whining with what sounded almost like protest as Captain Elena Rodriguez guided her ship through the complex dance of ground traffic and coordination that emergency returns required. She had been flying for 15 years, had handled medical emergencies and drunk passengers and mechanical failures, but something about Michelle's radio report had left her with an uneasy feeling that went deeper than routine concern for crew safety. Elena emerged from the cockpit, expecting to find the aftermath of a serious altercation. Perhaps a drunk passenger in restraints or someone having a medical episode that had turned violent. But what she saw when she stepped into the first-class cabin made her stomach drop through the floor of the aircraft, and her mind struggled to process the scene before her. A slight teenage girl who couldn't have weighed more than 110 pounds was lying face down on the cabin floor with her wrists zip-tied behind her back, while two of Elena's largest male flight attendants loomed over her like hunters posing with their prize. The girl wasn't struggling or shouting or showing any signs of the violent behavior that had supposedly necessitated such extreme restraint. Instead, she lay perfectly still with the kind of controlled breathing that suggested someone in shock rather than someone who posed any kind of ongoing threat. Elena's father had taught her to read situations with the same precision she used for instrument approaches, and everything about this scene felt wrong in ways that made her professional instincts scream warnings that her crew had missed something fundamental about what had actually occurred. The disparity between the restrained girl and Michelle's description of a violent, dangerous passenger was so stark that Elena wondered if she had somehow walked into the wrong aircraft. "Where is the security threat?" Elena asked, her voice carrying the kind of controlled authority that came from years of making life-and-death decisions in high-pressure situations, her eyes scanning the cabin for signs of the dangerous individual who had supposedly required such dramatic intervention. Michelle stepped forward with the confidence of someone who believed she had handled a crisis with textbook precision, her uniform still crisp, despite the drama that had unfolded. her expression suggesting that she expected commendation rather than questioning for her actions. "Right there, Captain," she said, gesturing toward Zara with the kind of dismissive wave that suggested the restrained teenager was somehow self-evidently threatening. "We have her completely secured now." Elena looked down at Zara, taking in the expensive sneakers and carefully chosen outfit that suggested someone heading to an important event rather than someone planning to cause trouble on an aircraft, and felt her confusion deepen into something approaching alarm. The girl's breathing was shallow and controlled the kind of respiratory pattern Elena recognized from her own daughters when they were trying not to cry in public, and there was nothing in her posture or demeanor that suggested aggression or danger. "This child is your security threat," Elena asked, her voice carrying a note of incredulity that made Michelle's confidence waver slightly as she began to sense that her captain wasn't responding to the situation in the way she had expected. Patricia Davenport chose that moment to interject with the kind of theatrical urgency that had served her well throughout the confrontation, her voice rising to ensure that everyone in first class could hear her testimony about the terrible ordeal she had endured. "Captain, she's completely unstable," Patricia declared, her hands fluttering with performed distress. "She attacked your flight attendant and refused to follow safety instructions. I witnessed the entire assault, and I was genuinely afraid for my safety." Elena looked at Patricia with the kind of skeptical assessment she had learned to apply to passenger complaints that seemed too convenient or too dramatic to be entirely truthful, her experience with people in high-stress situations having taught her that witnesses often saw what they wanted to see rather than what actually happened. Something about Patricia's performance felt rehearsed, too polished for someone who had genuinely been traumatized by witnessing violence. "Get her up," Elena ordered, her voice carrying the steel of command authority that made it clear this was not a request subject to discussion or delay. "Get her off the floor immediately." Jake and Tony exchanged uncertain glances, suddenly unsure about the situation they had helped create, as their captain's reaction suggested that they might have misunderstood something fundamental about what had occurred. "Captain, she's been violent," Tony protested weakly. "Michelle said she assaulted crew members and posed a threat to flight safety." "I said get her up now!" Elena roared, her voice cracking with the kind of intensity that made everyone in first class jump and immediately understand that their captain was not interested in hearing justifications or explanations from crew members who had apparently acted without proper assessment of the situation they were handling. Jake and Tony moved with reluctant efficiency to lift Zara from the floor, their hands gentle now in a way they hadn't been during the takedown, as if Elena's anger had suddenly made them aware that they might have made a serious error in judgment. Zara swayed when they got her to her feet, her legs unsteady from the time spent restrained on the floor and her balance compromised by having her hands secured behind her back. Elena reached out instinctively to steady her, feeling the trembling that ran through the girl's entire body like vibrations from a tuning fork that had been struck too hard. And in that moment of contact, she understood with absolute clarity that her crew had committed a terrible mistake that would have consequences far beyond anything they could imagine. "Are you okay?" Miss Elena asked, her voice gentler now as she recognized that she was dealing with a traumatized child rather than a security threat, her eyes taking in the tear tracks on Zara's cheeks and the way she held herself with the careful stillness of someone who had learned that any movement might be interpreted as aggression. Zara looked up at Elena with eyes that held a combination of fear and dignity that reminded the captain of her own daughters, and when she spoke her voice was steady despite everything she had endured. "I want my hands free," she said simply, the words carrying more authority than any of the shouting that had preceded them. Elena understood that she was standing at a crossroads that would define not just the remainder of this flight, but potentially the remainder of her career, and she made the decision that her conscience demanded regardless of whatever protocols her crew believed they had been following. "Cut her restraints," she ordered, her voice carrying the kind of finality that made it clear this was not open for debate or discussion. Michelle's eyes widened with what looked like genuine panic as she realized that her captain was not going to support the actions she had taken in response to what she still believed had been a legitimate security threat. Captain protocol clearly states that once restraints have been applied to a combative passenger, they should remain in place until law enforcement can take custody. She protested, her voice rising with the desperation of someone who could feel control slipping away. "Damn your protocols!" Elena snapped, grabbing the safety shears from the emergency medical kit and pushing past Jake with enough force to make it clear that she would brook no interference with her decision to free a child who had been subjected to treatment that looked increasingly like abuse rather than appropriate security response. She positioned herself behind Zara with the careful precision of someone who understood that this moment was being recorded by multiple passengers and that her actions would be scrutinized by investigators and attorneys and review boards for months to come. But none of that mattered compared to doing what was obviously right in a situation that had gone terribly wrong. The plastic zip ties fell to the cabin floor with a sound that seemed to echo through the suddenly silent first-class cabin, and Elena could see the deep red indentations they had left on Zara's wrists, physical evidence of restraint that had been excessive and inappropriate for any situation short of genuine violence or threats to aircraft safety. "I am so sorry," Elena said, her voice carrying the weight of genuine remorse as she helped Zara rub circulation back into her hands, the simple, human gesture feeling inadequate compared to the trauma that had been inflicted, but representing at least a first step toward acknowledging that terrible mistakes had been made. Zara flexed her fingers with the careful movement of someone testing whether important parts of her body still functioned properly, her expression unreadable as she processed the captain's apology and tried to determine whether this represented genuine understanding or just another performance designed to manage a situation that had spiraled beyond control. "I need to see your identification and boarding documentation," Elena said, her voice carrying the tone of someone who was finally going to get to the bottom of what had actually happened, rather than relying on the increasingly questionable account provided by her crew members. Michelle reluctantly produced Zara's passport and boarding pass from where they had been confiscated during the restraint process, her hands shaking slightly as she handed over documents that she hoped would vindicate her actions, but that she was beginning to suspect might tell a very different story than the one she had constructed in her radio reports. Elena opened the passport with the careful attention of someone who understood that she was about to discover information that would change everything about how this situation would be resolved, her eyes scanning the personal details with growing comprehension of exactly how catastrophic her crew's actions had been. The name on the passport seemed to leap off the page with the force of a physical blow. Zara Elizabeth Williams, born in Atlanta, Georgia, age 16, with emergency contact information that made Elena's blood turn to ice water in her veins, as she realized that her crew had just committed what amounted to assault against the daughter of one of the most powerful women in the American legal system. Rebecca Williams was not just any federal judge. She was a legal titan whose decisions affected entire industries, and whose reputation for absolute integrity and zero tolerance for injustice had made her both respected and feared throughout the federal court system. She was known in legal circles as the Iron Gavel, a woman whose courtroom presence could reduce seasoned attorneys to stammering incompetence, and whose written opinions were studied in law schools as examples of judicial precision and moral clarity. Elena's mind raced through the implications of what she had just discovered her pilot's training and risk assessment, telling her that this was not just a customer service failure or even a case of excessive force, but a potential career-ending catastrophe that would have ripple effects throughout the airline industry and beyond. "Who is your mother?" Elena asked, though she already knew the answer and was desperately hoping that somehow the name in the passport belonged to a different Williams family, one that didn't have the power to destroy airlines and end careers with a single phone call. Zara raised her chin with the kind of quiet dignity that had sustained her through the worst moments of the assault and restraint. her voice clear and steady as she delivered the words that would transform everyone's understanding of what had just occurred. Federal Judge Zara Williams of the Southern District of New York. She said each word falling into the cabin's silence like stones dropped into still water. The reaction was immediate and devastating. Patricia Whitmore made a small choking sound as she realized that her performance as the victim of assault had been directed against the daughter of a woman who could destroy her husband's career and family fortune with a single judicial decision. Michelle Torres felt her knees go weak as she understood that she had just physically restrained and humiliated the child of a judge who was currently presiding over cases that could determine her airline's future operating permissions. Elena closed her eyes for a moment and tried to calculate whether there was any possible way to contain the damage that had already been done, but her pilot's training and emergency procedures told her that some situations were beyond salvage and required nothing more than preparation for the inevitable crash that was coming. Zara reached into her hoodie pocket and withdrew her cell phone with the careful deliberation of someone who understood that she was about to initiate a sequence of events that would change the lives of everyone in the first-class cabin. Her fingers steady despite everything she had endured as she scrolled through her contacts to find the number that would bring her nightmare to an end. The phone seemed to glow with potential energy as she held it up for everyone to see the cracked screen, a reminder of how it had been kicked across the cabin floor during her assault, but the device still functioned well enough to make the call that would summon forces beyond anything the flight crew had prepared themselves to face. "I don't need to use your phone," Captain Zara said, her voice carrying a calm authority that seemed to fill the space around her as passengers and crew members began to understand that the balance of power in the cabin had shifted in ways they were only beginning to comprehend. "And I don't need anyone to explain anything for me." She pressed the contact labeled Mom and activated the speakerphone function, ensuring that everyone in first class would be able to hear both sides of the conversation that was about to unfold. Her finger hovering over the call button for just a moment as she considered the magnitude of what she was about to set in motion. The phone rang once in the chambers of Federal Judge Zara Williams, where she was currently presiding over a hearing that involved executives from 3 major airlines, including the one that employed the crew members who had just made the worst mistake of their professional lives. The timing was so perfect that it seemed orchestrated by some cosmic sense of justice that demanded accountability for those who abused their power. "Zara, you should be in the air by now." Judge Williams answered, her voice carrying the kind of controlled authority that made hardened criminals confess and corporate executives reveal their crimes even through a cell phone speaker that crackled with the electronic distortion of an aircraft cabin. "Why are you calling me?" The voice that emerged from the phone seemed to change the atmospheric pressure in the cabin, and Elena could see her crew members' faces go pale as they began to understand exactly who they were about to be forced to confront. This wasn't just any angry parent. This was a woman who wielded the power of the federal government and who had built her career on ensuring that justice was served, regardless of who tried to avoid accountability. Zara took a deep breath and allowed the teenager inside her to surface for the first time since the ordeal began. Her voice breaking with the accumulated trauma of being assaulted and restrained and humiliated by people who were supposed to ensure her safety. "Mom," she said, the single word carrying more emotional weight than all of Michelle's radio reports combined. "I'm still at JFK. The flight crew pinned me to the floor and zip-tied my hands behind my back. They hurt me and they said they're taking me to jail." The silence that followed was so absolute that it seemed to absorb sound rather than simply represent its absence, and Elena could almost feel the temperature in the cabin drop as Judge Williams processed what her daughter had just told her. When she spoke again, her voice was quieter than before, which somehow made it infinitely more terrifying than any amount of shouting could have been. "Who did this to you?" "Zara, Judge. Williams asked, each word precisely enunciated with the kind of careful diction that suggested she was already building a case that would be prosecuted with the full force of federal law. "Who put their hands on my daughter?" Elena felt her knees go weak as she realized that she was about to be required to explain to a federal judge why her crew had physically assaulted a minor passenger, and she understood with crystal clarity that there was no explanation that would be sufficient to justify what had occurred under her command and supervision. "The flight crew," Zara replied, her voice growing stronger as she felt the protection of her mother's authority reaching through the phone to surround her with the kind of safety that came from being connected to someone who had the power to demand answers and ensure consequences. "The captain is standing right here. Put the captain on the phone immediately." Judge Williams commanded, her voice carrying the tone that had made attorneys tremble and corporate executives confess their crimes, rather than face the consequences of lying under oath. Elena took the phone with hands that trembled despite her years of training in high-pressure situations, understanding that she was about to have the most important conversation of her professional life with a woman who had the power to destroy not just her career, but potentially her freedom if criminal charges were warranted for what had occurred under her authority. "Judge Williams," Elena said, her voice barely above a whisper as she tried to find words that could somehow explain the inexplicable. "This is Captain Elena Rodriguez. I want you to know that I had no knowledge of what my crew was doing until after it had already occurred." "Captain Rodriguez," Judge Williams replied, her voice carrying the kind of deadly calm that preceded the most devastating legal decisions. "I want you to understand something very clearly. I am currently sitting in a hearing with the CEO of your airline discussing safety protocols and crew training standards. I am going to put this call on speaker, and you are going to explain to him and to me exactly why my minor daughter was assaulted by your crew instead of being safely transported to her audition at Juilliard." Elena closed her eyes and tried to find some prayer or plea that might protect her from the storm that was about to break. But she knew with the certainty of someone trained in emergency procedures that some disasters were beyond any human ability to prevent or contain. The 30 minutes that passed while Flight 847 waited at the gate felt like geological time to everyone trapped in the first-class cabin, each second stretching into an eternity of anticipation and dread, as the crew members contemplated the approaching reckoning that would determine not just their professional futures, but potentially their personal freedom as well. Elena had not returned to the cockpit after her phone conversation with Judge Williams, choosing instead to position herself as a protective barrier between her traumatized passenger and the crew members whose actions had created this catastrophe. She stood with her arms crossed and her expression grim, watching the jet bridge through the aircraft windows for signs of the arrival that would transform this situation from a customer service failure into a federal case. Michelle Torres had retreated to the galley where she sat on a jump seat with her head in her hands, her uniform wrinkled now and her confidence completely shattered as she replayed every decision that had led to this moment and tried to find some explanation that might save her career. The union representative she had called was already on his way to the airport, but she knew with growing certainty that no amount of legal protection would be sufficient to shield her from the consequences of what she had done. Patricia Whitmore had pulled a blanket over her head and was frantically typing on her phone, trying to reach her husband to warn him about the legal tsunami that was about to crash over their family as a result of her performance as the victim of an assault that had never occurred. Her social media posts from earlier in the day, bragging about teaching entitled teenagers about respect and proper behavior, were already being screenshot and archived by strangers who understood that they were documenting evidence of premeditated harassment. Jake Morrison and Tony Rodriguez sat in their assigned seats with the hollow expressions of men who had followed orders without questioning their appropriateness and who were now beginning to understand that blind obedience to authority was not going to protect them from accountability for their actions. They kept glancing at Zara, who sat quietly in her assigned seat with her hands folded in her lap, her dignity intact despite everything she had endured. The first sign of Judge Williams's arrival was the sudden appearance of additional Port Authority police officers at the gate area, their presence indicating that whatever was about to occur would require crowd control and security coordination beyond the normal scope of airline operations. Elena could see through the windows that news vans were already pulling up to the terminal, suggesting that word of the incident had somehow reached the media despite the crew's attempts to handle the situation quietly. Then the jet bridge began to vibrate with the sound of purposeful footsteps, and Elena felt her stomach clench as she realized that her moment of accountability had finally arrived. The aircraft door opened to admit not just Judge Williams, but a small army of federal marshals, FBI agents, and attorneys whose presence transformed the Boeing 737 into something resembling a courtroom, where justice would be dispensed with swift and terrible efficiency. Judge Rebecca Williams entered her daughter's nightmare with the kind of controlled grace that made it clear she was accustomed to walking into situations where her presence alone could change outcomes and determine fates. She was not a large woman physically, but her authority filled the cabin space like a force of nature, and Elena could see her crew members instinctively shrinking away from someone whose power over their lives was absolute and immediate. She wore a simple black coat over what Elena assumed was her judicial robes, her graying hair pulled back in a style that suggested someone who had no time for vanity or appearance management when more important matters demanded her attention. Her eyes swept the cabin with the precision of someone trained to assess evidence and determine truth-taking in the damaged music scores, the zip-tie remnants on the floor, and the defensive postures of people who knew they were guilty of inexcusable behavior. When her gaze landed on Zara, Elena saw the transformation from federal judge to protective mother that occurred in the space of a heartbeat. Her expression softening as she took in her daughter's appearance and quickly assessed the extent of the trauma that had been inflicted by people who were supposed to ensure passenger safety rather than create additional dangers. "Show me your wrists," Judge Williams said quietly, her voice carrying the tone she might use with a key witness whose testimony would determine the outcome of a major case. Zara held out her hands, revealing the deep purple bruising and raw skin where the zip ties had cut into her flesh, physical evidence of excessive force that would be documented and photographed and entered into legal proceedings that would destroy careers and potentially result in criminal prosecutions. Judge Williams examined her daughter's injuries with the clinical attention of someone building a case, her fingers gentle as she traced the marks that would serve as Exhibit A in proceedings that would transform airline industry training protocols and ensure that no other child would endure what Zara had experienced. "Captain Rodriguez," Judge Williams said, without looking away from her daughter's injuries, her voice carrying the kind of authority that made Elena snap to attention despite her civilian status. "I need you to understand something very clearly. What happened to my daughter on your aircraft constitutes assault, false imprisonment, and civil rights violations under federal law." Elena nodded, knowing that any attempt to minimize or excuse what had occurred would only make the legal consequences more severe for everyone involved. "Yes, Your Honor," she replied, using the formal address that seemed appropriate when speaking to someone who held the power to destroy her life with a single legal decision. "The FBI will be conducting interviews with every member of your crew and every passenger who witnessed these events." Judge Williams continued, her voice taking on the tone she used when delivering sentences that would change defendants' lives forever. "The Department of Transportation will be reviewing your airline's training protocols and safety procedures. The Department of Justice will be determining whether criminal charges are warranted for the assault of a minor." The words fell on Elena's crew like hammer blows, each agency mentioned representing another level of investigation and potential prosecution that would scrutinize every aspect of their professional conduct and personal character. Michelle made a small whimpering sound from the galley, finally understanding that her 20-year career was not just over, but would likely end with criminal convictions that would make future employment impossible. Judge Williams helped her daughter to her feet with the careful attention of someone who understood that trauma could manifest in unexpected ways. Her protective instincts engaged fully as she prepared to escort Zara away from the people who had transformed what should have been a routine flight into a federal case study in the abuse of authority and the importance of protecting the vulnerable from those who would harm them. 6 months later, the 42nd floor conference room in a Manhattan skyscraper offered a panoramic view of a city that usually inspired awe in visitors. But for the 3 people sitting on the defendant's side of the mahogany table, the windows might as well have been looking out over the edge of a cliff that represented the end of everything they had once believed about their lives and futures. Michelle Torres looked like she had aged a decade in the month since Flight 847. Her once pristine appearance replaced by the hollow-eyed exhaustion of someone who had been systematically stripped of everything that had once defined her identity and purpose. The airline industry had blacklisted her so thoroughly that she couldn't find work at regional carriers or cargo airlines, and she was currently serving coffee and cleaning tables at a truck stop diner outside Newark. Her aviation career reduced to a cautionary tale told in crew training sessions. Patricia Whitmore's transformation was even more dramatic. Her designer wardrobe and perfectly maintained appearance replaced by the desperate economy of someone whose husband's assets had been frozen pending SEC investigation, and whose social circle had evaporated overnight when video of her behavior on Flight 847 went viral with commentary that made her a symbol of entitled racism and manufactured victimhood. Jake Morrison and Tony Rodriguez sat with the defeated postures of men who had learned that following orders without questioning their morality was not a defense that impressed federal investigators or provided protection from criminal prosecution. Their careers in aviation were over, their personal reputations destroyed and their future employment prospects limited to jobs that didn't require background checks or references from previous employers. Across the polished conference table sat Judge Rebecca Williams reviewing settlement documents with the same meticulous attention she brought to federal cases that affected entire industries. Her fountain pen moving with precise efficiency as she finalized terms that would ensure her daughter's trauma resulted in changes that protected other children from similar experiences. Beside her sat Zara, radiant in a simple black dress that suggested someone who had not only survived her ordeal, but had transformed it into strength and purpose that would define the rest of her life. Her acceptance to Juilliard had been accompanied by a full scholarship that recognized her musical talent, while her Harmony Bridge app had expanded globally with partnerships that brought music education to underserved communities worldwide. The settlement terms are final and non-negotiable. Judge Williams stated, her voice carrying the authority that had made her one of the most respected federal judges in the country. This is not a discussion or a plea bargaining session. These are the consequences of your actions. The airline's attorney, a man who looked like he had spent the past 6 months aging in dog years, nodded with the resigned acceptance of someone who understood that his clients had no leverage and no alternatives to accepting whatever terms Judge Williams chose to impose. The video evidence was overwhelming, the witness testimony was damning, and the physical evidence of Zara's injuries made any defense impossible. Ms. Torres, Judge Williams said, looking directly at the former flight attendant who had initiated the assault that destroyed her own life along with several others, "You will personally pay $50,000 in damages to my daughter, and you will never work in any capacity that involves interaction with the public. Your actions demonstrated such poor judgment and disregard for human dignity that you cannot be trusted with authority over others." Michelle nodded through tears that carried the salt taste of complete defeat. Understanding that the judge's sentence was both legally binding and morally appropriate for someone who had used her uniform and authority to inflict trauma on a child whose only crime had been existing in a space where someone else decided she didn't belong. Ms. Whitmore, Judge Williams continued turning her attention to the woman whose false accusations had provided the pretext for her daughter's assault. Your husband's SEC investigation has been expedited based on evidence that emerged during the investigation of your behavior on Flight 847. Your social media posts and witness statements have been forwarded to federal prosecutors who are considering perjury charges. Patricia's lawyer whispered urgently in her ear, but she was beyond legal advice or damage control, her life having become a cautionary tale about the dangers of assuming that privilege would protect her from the consequences of deliberate cruelty toward people she considered beneath her notice. The final terms of the settlement included establishment of the Williams Foundation for airline passenger rights funded by the airline and dedicated to ensuring that discrimination and excessive force by crew members would be met with swift legal consequences that protected travelers regardless of their age, race, or perceived status. As Zara and her mother walked through the glass doors of the law office and into the Manhattan afternoon, the spring air carried the promise of new beginnings and the satisfaction of justice properly served, though the real victory had been won not in courtrooms or conference rooms, but in the moment when Zara had refused to let other people's hatred diminish her sense of her own worth and dignity. "I'm proud of you," Judge Williams said as they reached the sidewalk, her voice carrying the warmth that she reserved for moments when her role as mother took precedence over her identity as a federal judge, her arm slipping around her daughter's shoulders in a gesture that was both protective and celebratory. Zara leaned into her mother's embrace, feeling the solid strength of someone who had taught her that power used properly was a tool for protecting the vulnerable rather than oppressing them, and that dignity was something that could never be taken away by people who lacked it themselves. "I kept thinking about what you always told me," Zara replied, her voice steady with the confidence of someone who had discovered her own strength under the worst possible circumstances. Which lesson was that Judge Williams asked, though she suspected she already knew which piece of maternal wisdom had sustained her daughter through her ordeal and its aftermath. "That respect isn't something you have to earn from people who don't deserve to give it." Zara said the words carrying the weight of hard-won understanding about the difference between being respected and demanding respect, between proving herself worthy and refusing to accept other people's assessment of her worth. They walked toward the waiting car that would take them to the airport, where a private jet paid for by the airline as part of the settlement agreement would carry Zara to London for the Juilliard audition that had been rescheduled to accommodate the legal proceedings that had consumed the past 6 months of their lives. The violin case, Judge Williams observed, noting how her daughter held the silver container that had been at the center of so much conflict and trauma. "It's more than just an instrument now," Zara nodded, understanding that her mother was referring to how the case had become a symbol of everything she had fought to protect during those terrible minutes on Flight 847. Not just the Stradivarius inside, but her dreams and dignity and right to exist in spaces where other people questioned her presence. "It's proof," Zara said, simply, her voice carrying the quiet confidence of someone who had learned that the most powerful response to hatred was not anger, but excellence. Not revenge, but the relentless pursuit of dreams that small-minded people had tried to destroy. Proof that they couldn't break what matters most. As they settled into the back seat of the car, Zara opened the violin case for the first time since the assault, her fingers finding the strings with the muscle memory of someone who had never stopped believing that music would ultimately triumph over the noise of people who tried to silence what they didn't understand. 6 months after the settlement, Flight 847's video had become mandatory training material for every major airline, with Zara's face calm, dignified, unbroken, despite everything they had done to her, serving as a permanent reminder that every passenger deserved respect, regardless of their age, appearance, or the assumptions that uniformed officials might make about where they belonged. The Williams Foundation had awarded full musical education scholarships to over 200 underserved students, while Zara's Harmony Bridge app had partnered with school districts nationwide to ensure that her traumatic experience was transformed into opportunities for countless other young people who might otherwise never have access to the arts education that could change their lives. As Zara took the stage at Royal Albert Hall for her debut performance with the London Symphony Orchestra, Judge Williams watched from the audience with the quiet pride of someone who had raised a daughter strong enough to transform injustice into inspiration, proving that the girl who had been pinned to an airplane floor could rise to command the world's most prestigious stages through nothing more powerful than talent, dignity, and the unshakable knowledge that no one could ever take away what truly mattered.